Hi, everyone. This is Mark McCord of Some Stops Along the Way podcast. We're going to take a side road today from our normal podcast episode because we got a really important issue that I want to talk about. And I'd like to say I wish I could tell you that I've been wrong on this issue and everything's okay, but I can't tell you that. Because the issue I'm going to discuss today for Europe is every bit as bad as I said it was going to be, and it's going to get worse. And that's the issue of migration, undocumented migration. When we talk about undocumented migration, we talk about we're talking about people who come from countries into the European Union that are that don't have the proper documentation and don't have the proper uh, migration status, if you will. These typically are people coming from countries where there are either very challenging economic or geopolitical situations, like refugees from Africa who are coming largely because of economic inequities in their country, Ukrainians that are migrating into other parts of Europe because of war, etc. The question is, why does Europe have to take them? And the answer is fairly easy. There are three reasons. First of all, the 1951 Refugee Convention, which requires states to process asylum claims, most importantly, by EU law, which is called the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which prohibits turning away from people who request protection. And there's also the non-refoulement rules forbidding countries in sending people back to places where they face persecution or death. Of course, the migrants can make a strong case that if you send me back, I'm going to face huge hardships, maybe even death. They get rid of their passports, they get rid of their documentation status, so the EU basically has to accept them. And I've said for years now that EU policy is flawed, that migration is going to become one of, if not the most important and divisive issues on the European continent, and that in trying to fix it, the European Union is actually making it worse. Of course, the EU has a strong propensity to make just about anything that it gets involved in worse because of its bureaucracy. But certainly on this issue, that's been the case. Like I said, I wish I'd been wrong. But look what's happened here in August with more than 60,000 Moroccans and others coming through Morocco in 24 to 36 hours, overwhelming the Spanish autonomous territory in North Africa bordering Morocco of Ceuta. These migrants flooded in a very short amount of time, and chaos ensued. Looting, lawlessness, and I'm not being anti-migrant because we saw it in real time on video. So I'm not making this stuff up, friends. It happened. And it continues to happen. Where migrants are flooding into Europe, and rather than wanting to assimilate into the culture of the countries where they end up, they are using EU law to force the countries to allow them to live any way they want. and to act in ways that many local citizens find abhorrent. And this has given rise to a number of conservative type movements like True Brit in the UK that are pushing back against the migration issue because it's become a cultural problem for countries throughout the EU. Now, I know my EU friends are immediately going to say, well, why is an American talking about this? Because you have your own problems in this area. And we do. We do. They're not as pronounced as they were, but certainly we have had problems in this area as well. But to my European friends, I will tell you, this is not new information. And there's nothing that I'm saying that is intended to be, nor is it, racist or anti-migrant. What I'm saying is that the European Union has once again sold you down the river. Countries that have been desperate to join the EU for the economic benefits that it provides also have to accept the political realities of the EU. And as I said, the political reality is that the European Union's involvement in core issues typically makes the situation worse. I just wrote an article about unfinished wars on the European continent, about places like Cyprus, Georgia, Ukraine, Bosnia, that are still, to this day, either directly in conflict or suffering from the failed policies to end the conflict that were perpetuated by both the United Nations and the European Union. The migration issue, which we're touching on today, which is absolutely lost in a quagmire of bureaucracy and political rhetoric. Issues such as economic issues, such as the debt bailout that happened to Greece years ago, or the European Central Bank were so desperate to keep countries on the euro that they just continued to reward bad behavior. I'll say this, and this is, again, this is not new information for anyone who knows me. I've said for many years that the European Union will eventually have fractures that it can't fix. Brexit was just an example of what is likely to happen over the next 10 to 20 years within the entirety of the EU. And migration may be the issue that makes this happen even faster. It may be the issue that once and for all empowers especially conservative groups within Europe who have typically not been aligned with the EU to take power in key countries. You've already lost the UK. If the government of France would turn, if the government of Germany would turn, the government of Poland had turned, it's now turned a little bit back. But if these countries decide that the EU is no longer worth it, they're the ones paying the bills, especially Germany and France. And this could create a very challenging situation for our friends in Brussels. And they can't seem to see it. They seem to be living in some type of parallel universe that makes them think that anything they do in Brussels is just going to be, number one, is right, which is incorrect, an incorrect assumption. But secondly, it'll just be accepted by governments around Europe. And there's coming a tipping point. And as I said, I believe migration may be that tipping point where governments begin to fall because they are just blindly adhering to EU regulations. I've been to EU headquarters. I've been to Brussels on a number of occasions. I can tell you that the system is broken. That what's happening in Brussels today has more to do with bureaucracy and the consolidation of power than it has to do with the well-being of Europe. And that's a fact. And migration is one of the issues that's brought this to the forefront. It's not going to get any better. In fact, it's going to get worse until one of two things happen. Either the European Union has to take drastic measures to stem the flow of migration and to address this in a reasonable way that will allow countries some autonomy in how they protect their borders. Or governments are going to fall, they're going to turn against the EU, and the Union is going to fracture once and for all. And when that happens, that opens Pandora's box for any number of things, all bad, to happen in Europe. So, I don't usually go on diatribes, and I don't think this is a diatribe. I think it's a reality. This is where we are. Some of my European viewers, if you have a different point of view, I'd love to hear it and love to have an informed and reasonable debate on this issue. But the fact is that the numbers are against you when you start talking about migration. And precedent is against you when you start talking about EU policy. It comes down to this. How can a country control its own borders, ensure the promulgation of its culture and history and geopolitical strength when it can't control its own borders? When it can't control its own economic policy? When it can't control its own political issues? When individuals in Brussels who are not popularly elected are given the power to make decisions that affect the entire continent and usurp the autonomy of countries. This is the Achilles heel of the European Union. And it will be the undoing, I predict, in the next 10 to 20 years of the European Union as we know it today. And I think that what we've seen in Ceuta and other migration issues throughout Europe is the jangling of the keys to Pandora's box. If you disagree, I'd love to hear from you. If you agree, I'd love to hear from you too. Let's have the conversation. This has been a special edition of Some Stops Along the Way. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it made you think. And I hope that you will engage in dialogue among yourselves and with me. Let's have the conversation. See you next time on Some Stops Along the Way.